Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Wednesday Global Talk at the Center for Global Studies on this beautiful morning. We will, on this beautiful morning, with this appreciation for the beautiful natural setting we're in and the Center's recognition of the importance of place, we start with the territory acknowledgement. So we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the Center stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. At first, one more thing before introducing our speaker this morning. It's what we're calling some housekeeping issues, which have changed a little bit, as you might have noticed over the last week or two. We'll ask that you please keep your microphone muted and your video off or camera off until our Q&A. And then when we do sort of gather, if only virtually, for our discussion at the end of the talk, we'll ask that if you're comfortable, please, if you can, to please turn your camera on, and we'll see if we can kind of foster something of a more, a sense of community, a virtual community with our cameras on. But we'll still ask you to keep your microphone muted until you have a question or a comment. Please use the hand function in Zoom to draw attention to your comment, or you're, of course, feel free also to use the chat function in Zoom for comments, for questions. We'll monitor that during the talk, or often people have been posting useful links that have been a very useful function also. And of course, as you all know, the presentation is being recorded. So tremendous pleasure to be able to introduce our visiting graduate fellow for the year here at the Center for Global Studies, Maria Finnsdotter. Maria is doing a PhD in sociology at the University of Toronto, but in a sense, she's coming home, having done her BA in sociology and her MA in sociology, her BA in sociology here at UVic, completing in 2016, before going to Toronto for her graduate studies. Her work aims to understand the particular gender drivers of radical right support and the place of women in racist and exclusionary politics. So very excited to hear Maria. Thank you so much for all you've contributed to the Center this year. I'll turn it over to you, Maria.
All right, thank you, Martin. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay, maybe I'll try and just share my screen. More slides here. All right. Okay. So again, thanks, Martin, for the introduction. And thank you also to CFGS and to Kayla, Jody, Rowan, and Martin for having me this year and for organizing all these talks and for keeping the community so together over, through all of COVID and the in-person, online, back and forth, all the confusion that's happened with that. And then also just a quick thank you to my supervisor, Jeff Buglers, for all of his support over the past few years. So I've called this talk Radical Right Women, Exploring the Gender Gap in the Nordic Countries. And it's based on my dissertation research. So it's very much still a work in progress. And so I'll start with an overview of the key literature that I'm using and those questions and puzzles that I'm interested in. And then I'll delve deeper into one of my papers, the first one, which is currently with my committee, so I'm more than happy to hear comments and suggestions. Okay, so my focus is primarily on the Nordic radical right. And to just start with a quick definition, there's a lot of debate in my subfield about how to exactly define the radical right. But I personally find Jens Rydgren's definition particularly useful, and it's the one that I use. So he sees the radical right as a family of parties broadly characterized by anti-establishment populism and ethno-nationalist xenophobia. And these are also parties that have platforms that tend to be rooted in a kind of social cultural authoritarianism that stresses the importance of the collective good above individual rights. Of the 5 Nordic countries, being Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, all but Iceland has a politically significant radical right party. So the Sweden Democrats have the 3rd largest seat share in parliament, though Sweden is having an election later this year, so that might change. And in the most recent election, the Finns followed the Social Democrats as the second largest electoral following, at 17.5%. Until recently, the Norwegian Progress Party sat in government in Norway as a junior partner in a coalition with the Conservatives. But the odd one out here would be the Danish People's Party, who've lost a significant amount of support, about half their vote share in 2019 compared to 2015. But this loss has been explained as an effect of the left in that country taking up a more anti-immigrant stance. So while it is, an electoral loss, they've lost a lot of their voter base, it could also be seen as a larger political win, and that they have managed to shift the general discourse around immigration towards the right. So the growth of the radical right is occurring within a larger context of political realignments, in particular to do with the weakening of party loyalties in Western Europe. So traditional cleavages around social and economic issues and class-based interests have been replaced to a large degree by a divide around post-materialist values, such as minority rights, culture, and concerns around assimilation and environmentalism. So just as traditional cleavages are declining in importance, party brand has been increasing, and party brand has been shown to affect voter behavior, particularly through how symbolic and emotional values of party brand appeal more to certain voters than to others. According to Clark and Stewart, a growing trend of de-identification has led to the growth of independence and the decline of strong party identifiers, so that individual voters are also now more volatile on their party affiliation. Also linked to this voter volatility is, sorry, the dinging, is a shift towards issue-based voting. So just as voters are becoming less identified with particular political parties, they're also more likely to make voting decisions based on specific policy points and party promises. And this underlines the importance now of values and issue saliency to party choice and voting behavior. So the radical right parties take up a wide range of fiscal and social policies, to the point where anti-immigrant sentiment is really, is really the only commonality between the various parties occupying this political space. And in fact, anti-immigrant sentiment is so central in radical right rhetoric and ideology that some scholars, in particular those working in the Dutch context, have begun to think about radical right parties as being essentially anti-immigrant parties. And recent social and political events, such as the so-called migrant crisis starting around 2015 and the 2008 financial collapse, have provided fertile soil for the European radical right, who frame immigration as a cultural and an economic threat, and link immigration to crime and social unrest in order to drum up support. So this quote I have here is taken from the Danish People's Party's official party program, which they make available in English as well as in Danish. So this is their translation, not mine. But this really demonstrates the hardline stance the party takes against immigration, as well as sort of hinting towards the importance of ethnicity and culture to the notion of nationality and belonging that's popular in this kind of politics. So here they say, right, Denmark is not an immigrant country and never has been. Thus, we will not accept transformation to a multi-ethnic society. So traditionally in the literature, a strong welfare state was considered to be a key factor to pressing support for radical right politics. And this idea, which is originally put forward by Swank and Betts in 2003 or so, it is that the welfare state moderates the negative effects of immigration, capital mobility, and trade openness that follow globalization. And these effects, tend to negatively impact low-skill manual workers and economically hurting mostly working-class men. And so the negative effects of globalization and deindustrialization turn this segment of the population against globalization, against immigration towards radical right politics. But the strong welfare state of the Nordic countries has not prevented a rise in radical right politics. And in fact, the radical right in the Nordic countries is characterized by a strong support for the welfare state, albeit within a welfare chauvinist framework. So welfare chauvinism is defined, as a system of collective social protection that's restricted to those belonging to the ethnically defined community who's contributed to it. So it's one important way in which the understanding of outsiders as threats to the well-being of the nation state is practiced. All four national parties profess the need for strong social support for children, the sick, and the elderly, but with an important caveat that it should not reach beyond the boundaries of citizenship and, within this framework, generally ethnic citizenship, or ethnic belonging, let's say. Welfare chauvinism then occurs when outsiders are understood as threats to the people of a welfare state, in particular by taking too much of the state resources. And more specifically within this framework, immigrants are seen as taking more from the state than they rightfully deserve. And so again, I just have some quotes here from the radical right parties, both the Sweden Democrats and the Finns, who used to be called the True Finns, but they've dropped that part of their name. Now they're just the Finns. But here they just say Swedish welfare should be for Swedish citizens, or that Finnish taxpayers are seeing too many expenditures on immigration to the point where elderly Finnish citizens are not being properly cared for. None of these things are necessarily true, but it's this framework about how the people who deserve support are being left out in the cold in order to care for people who don't deserve support. So radical right parties have been traditionally seen as men's parties, both because they're generally majority men, but also because of the masculine and even at times militaristic public images that they convey. So unsurprisingly, then, the radical right parties in the Nordic countries are all majority male. Among currently sitting members of parliament, less than 30% of the Sweden Democrats, Norwegian Progress Party, and the Finns are made up of women, and about 38% of the Danish People's Party representatives are women. So to put these numbers into perspective, while only about 28% of Sweden Democrats are elected Sweden Democrats are women, about half of the Swedish parliament overall is made up of women, as are 12 of the 22 cabinet ministers. So it's a real trend of underrepresentation. And this holds at all levels of the radical right, where women are less likely than men to support radical right politics, to vote for radical right parties, or to run for them, to attach their names to these parties. So this trend of underrepresentation is holding despite both the rise of prominent women on the radical right, such as the leaders Jensen and Kjærsgaard, and also despite the embrace of this gender egalitarian language by the Nordic radical right. So these parties are increasingly using progressive sexual and gender politics to couch their Islamophobia, which is a phenomenon which Sarah Ferris's book is pictured here, refers to as femonationalism. Basically, the radical right frames gender egalitarianism and tolerance to sexual diversity as being inherently Western, and misogyny or homophobia as a foreign and in particular Muslim import. And so in practice, this looks like things like the Sweden Democrats are trying to have laws against child marriage and forced marriage, which they're taking strong stances against these things, which are already illegal, but it's a way of couching Islamophobia, basically. But that said, women are increasingly being recognized as active participants in radical right and extremist political movements, correcting a historical gendered bias in the study of extreme right leaders and activists, a push led by scholars like Kathleen Blee. So Blee argues that these women's involvement actually stems from an alternative understanding of women's rights and femininity. So for example, women politicians on the radical right see the current neoliberal regime that demands women work as negating their, quote unquote, true roles as mothers and caregivers. However, as Molinari and Kjærsgaard argue, while entrance into the radical right politics serves to empower them in some ways, these women are nonetheless the minority in their parties and generally remain marginal actors within the male-dominated party structure. So as a result of this marginalization, elected women representatives from radical right parties can be quite passive once elected. So a recent example is from Reškova's study of the Slovakian parliament, where she found that women who were radical right MPs sponsored significantly less legislation and sat on fewer committees and boards than women in other parties. So in the traditional news press, coverage of women politicians is often grounded in stereotypical beliefs about women, as well as gendered norms about leadership and public behavior. While coverage of these women can focus on their emancipatory value, much of it takes up dominant narratives of women as mothers and carers, or alternatively is focused on their physical appearance. So most coverage, of course, is not overtly misogynistic, but it does tend to flatten and homogenize women politicians and their interests around traditional patriarchal notions of womanhood. Nordic newsrooms, like those in other countries, tend still to be male-dominated, which translates into some level of gender bias in coverage, such as the tendency for news media to devote relatively more time and space to male candidates. So representation of women politicians in the media has real consequences for their careers and election prospects. For example, media coverage that relies on gendered stereotypes, particularly among women as being more emotional or less competent or more passive, may bias voters against them. However, as politics are increasingly digitizing, new avenues for self-presentation and campaigning and recruitment are opening up. So we have new digital media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook that are presenting new opportunities for women in politics, as well as for other traditionally marginalized populations. And social media, it serves both to mobilize and recruit party supporters, but also to build individual politicians' brands and reputations outside of their parties. Hate groups and fringe politics, including that of the radical right, have also flourished online, using the anonymity and wide reach of the internet to proselytize, recruit, and build community. And that's not even to get into how social media allows them to bypass traditional news media gatekeepers. At the same time, social media is still a highly gendered space. In the early days of the internet, it was thought that the online world, would provide new opportunities and spaces for marginalized people. However, there's emerging evidence that political engagement and communication is not that different online than it is offline. Women and people of color routinely face harassment on social media, and political conversations are still generally dominated by white men. Moreover, while women's political engagement tends to be insensitive to gender, meaning that women voters are less influenced by the gender of candidates, men continue to be more likely to be interested in and engaged with politicians who are also men. Given then the male dominance of the electoral base of the radical right and the gendered biases of men voters online, it's likely that even online, women on the radical right continue to be marginalized and disadvantaged. So it's from this literature that I'm pulling together my dissertation. And I'm focused on three main questions. So first, what gender differences and attitudes and structural location explain the gender gap in radical right voting? Radical, not radial. And second, what is the ideological and attitudinal profile of that minority of women that does vote for the radical right? And three, are online gender inequalities more extreme among radical right parties than for other parties? So, does that, they tend to be more unequal offline, and I'm wondering, are they just as unequal online? Or does social media provide a new way for radical right women to build their presences? So my first two questions, my first two papers, are delving into the roots of the gender gap in radical right voting, examining not only why women are less likely to vote for the radical right than men, but also what drives that minority of women who do vote for the radical right to do so. Building on this, the third paper examines gender inequality online and the presence of anti-women sentiment within radical right politics. So that brings me neatly to my first dissertation paper, which is the only one that's fully written. But this one takes a deeper look at the gender differences in attitudes and structural positions that explain that gender gap in radical right voting. And I'm also trying to engage in I'm treating this more as like a statistical case study than theory testing, and trying to think through a bit any meaningful differences between the four Nordic countries and how these can be explained by looking at differences in context. So within this literature on populist or radical right-wing voting, there are several explanations as to why women tend to vote for the radical right in smaller numbers than their male counterparts. And if we sort of boil it down, the main threads of these arguments is that women are more likely to be employed in service and public sector work, and so are less likely to be affected by deindustrialization than men, and so are less likely to turn against globalization, and so are less likely to support radical right politics, sort of this through line. And at the same time, given women's more precarious social and economic positions, they tend to also favor state involvement in the economy at higher rates, and support social welfare policies, which also then pulls them towards the left of the political spectrum. And more than that, scholars including Spearsings and Zabslov have argued that women are, in fact, less likely to hold anti-immigrant sentiment, or that regardless of the level of anti-immigrant sentiment, that issues of immigration and cultural diversity are just less politically salient to women than men. Similarly, some scholars have argued that women's social roles as carers has shaped their programmatic preferences, driving them to support more compassionate policies around welfare and immigration. So here I have a graph with predicted probabilities of voting for the radical right. This is taken from the European Social Survey. It's the same data I used for my analysis in this paper. And basically what this shows is that men in all 4 Nordic countries are significantly more likely to vote for the radical right than women are. And interestingly, also the gap between men and women in the Nordic countries is quite a bit bigger than it is in the rest of Western Europe, which is this pooled sample here. But so explanations of the gender gap in radical right voting tend to focus largely on the demand side, differences between men and women. So broadly, because of their structural and attitudinal tendencies, women demand politics that support social welfare and moderation on issues like that of immigration. And they demonstrate this demand through choosing to vote for more left-leaning political parties. Conversely, voters who hold strong anti-immigrant views, who are just so happen to be more likely to be men, are more likely to support parties who advocate those views as well. So we pair this with the breakdown of traditional cleavages, such as socioeconomic cleavages. Political values and issue salience become increasingly important predictors of party preference and vote choice. So as Carlson and Ardal put it, voters make their decisions based on which parties they believe are better able to handle the issue that they find most important. So in this way, party policies and platform promises matter to vote choice. As Golder has shown, radical right votes are not just protest votes. Radical right voters are aware of radical right party policies, and they are voting for those policies. And so given the differences between men and women in their vote choice, it's worth asking not only what structural and attitudinal factors influence their political priorities, but also what role party platforms play in attracting women's voters. There we go. So for this paper, I used a logistic regression decomposition method to model gender differences in the likelihood of voting for the radical right. So this method breaks down a group difference in a binary outcome into the individual contributions of independent variables. So this means that it sheds light on compositional differences between 2 groups and how those relate to an outcome, but it doesn't actually reveal anything about any gender differences in the strength of variables. So in this case, my models show the individual contributions of gender differences in structural and attitudinal variables to the overall gender gap in radical right voting. So for this, I used data from the last 3 waves of the European Social Survey. So that was data collected in 2014, 16, and 18. And I stuck with just those 3 years, so just to cover only 1 election period in each country. I pooled the data across waves for each country and ran separate country models. And the effect of these wave dummies was not statistically significant in any model. So this would imply that I'm not missing a statistically significant amount of variation in the gender gap over time by using a pooled sample. The dependent variable, or the outcome variable in all models, was voting for the radical right, coded as voting for each national radical right party. And the models were compared across the gender variable. Independent variables were selected from the literature on drivers of radical right support, and these included public sector employment, unemployment, education, negative feelings towards sexual minorities, the perception of income inadequacy, lack of confidence in the European Union, and support for government redistribution of wealth, as well as anti-immigrant sentiment, which was an index constructed from questions on the effects of immigrants on the economy, on national culture, and on the country more generally. So this table shows the results from the Danish decomposition models. I have all of the tables in the slides and appendices, if anyone is interested, but I figured I'd just stick with one because otherwise it's a lot of numbers. So the table shows both the decomposition model using only structural variables and then also the full model, which included attitudinal variables as well. So in the structural only model here, the difference between men and women was 0.0409, and the difference explained by the model was 0.0140. And what's neat about this method is that the regression coefficients produced, they represent that contribution to the total gap. So they can also be used to estimate the percentage contribution of each individual variable to the total gap. So using the total difference and the difference explained, the structural model explains only 34.2% of the gender gap in radical right voting. And so the other almost 66% is likely some mixture of variables that aren't included here, and then also the coefficient effects, which are the gender differences in strength, which aren't included by the model. And in the structural model, public sector employment and education are significant. So they are the main contributors to the gender gap. The full model, on the other hand, explains significantly more of the gap, almost 87%. And this one produced significant regression coefficients for the effects of anti-immigrant sentiment and lack of trust in the European Union. Sure, that one. So gender differences in lack of trust in the European Union explained about 25% of the gap, whereas anti-immigrant sentiment explained almost 40% of the total gap between men and women. And so just means that anti-immigrant sentiment is the most important contributor to the gender gap in radical right voting here. So as I said, I won't go into detail on all the models, but taken all together, there are certain trends that become clear. So the logistic regression decomposition analyses point to a significant difference between men and women, where men in all 4 countries are significantly more likely than women to vote for the radical right. And another trend was that anti-immigrant sentiment is the most important contributor to the gap, but that between the structural and the full model, the effects of public sector employment and education and unemployment disappear. And so that would imply that some part of their effect on the gender gap is being channeled through or absorbed by some of these attitudinal variables. So these findings are in line with the general understanding of the gender gap in radical right voting. And this understanding, as detailed earlier, is that women's more precarious socioeconomic positions and their higher reliance on the welfare state makes them less inclined to express anti-immigrant views and thereby less likely to vote for the radical right. However, it may be that this explanation now fits the Nordic countries better than most other European countries. So studies of the gender gap in other European country contexts, such as that done by Hartveld and colleagues in 2015, have found that women are not less anti-immigrant than men, but just that immigration is overall less salient to their vote choice. Similarly, Nana Meyer in 2015 found in her study of the gender gap in France that French women are overall very similar to men and tend to be driven to vote for the radical right by the same concerns about unemployment and economic insecurity, Euroscepticism, anti-immigrant sentiment. Others still have found even higher rates of anti-immigrant sentiment among women when compared to men. But conversely, the logistic regression decompositions that I ran found that women were overall less anti-immigrant than men, and that this explained a significant amount of the gender gap in radical right voting in all 4 Nordic countries. And so this in turn may help explain why the gender gap is so much smaller in the rest of Western Europe when compared to the Nordic countries. So while there was little variation between the 4 countries in the size of the gender gap, certain differences in the content of the gap, so to speak, came up in the analysis. And here I'll speak to just 3 of those findings. So first, only in Norway were gender differences in public sector employment and unemployment significant contributors to the gender gap in the full model, not just the structural one. And this importance of structural location may be linked to the fiscal and economic policies of the Norwegian Progress Party. So the Norwegian Progress Party, which started as an anti-tax protest party, has embraced the most neoliberal and libertarian approach to the economics of the 4 parties and favors lowering taxes and decreasing state redistribution of wealth. So given women's general support of left-wing economic policies, the positions taken by the Progress Party on taxation, social support, and welfare may work to alienate women voters to a larger degree than men. Second, only in Sweden was anti-LGBT sentiment significant. So the appropriation of language of female empowerment by the radical right is common and generally used to further anti-immigrant agendas. But despite the rhetorical embrace of gender egalitarianism, the radical right remains deeply committed to heteronormative expressions of gender and family structures. Unsurprisingly then, the Sweden Democrats advocate traditional family values and the maintenance of traditional social hierarchies and cultural practices. And this comes from a deep concern with the family as a vehicle of cultural transmission. So this may explain why Sweden is the only country model where anti-LGBT sentiment was a significant attitudinal influence on the gender gap. So put simply, women in Sweden are less likely to express anti-LGBT sentiment than men, and as a result are less likely to vote for the radical right. So one can extrapolate from this that the Sweden Democrats are in some way appealing to anti-LGBT voters while alienating others. So this is one way in which I'm sort of thinking through how party positions have the potential to translate into differences in the character and the size of electoral support. And finally, all 4 national radical right parties advocate for less immigration, stricter restrictions on immigration, and more emphasis on the assimilation of immigrants. For example, the Sweden Democrats have proposed a full-on ban on accepting asylum seekers. Unsurprisingly, then, gender differences in anti-immigrant sentiment were the single largest contributor to the gender gap in every country's full model. So put simply, women reported lower levels of anti-immigrant sentiment, which explained much of the gender gap in radical right voting. These findings are largely in line with the growing body of work on the European radical right, which emphasizes the importance of anti-immigrant attitudes to the platforms and goals of the parties and to the motivations and voting behaviors of radical right supporters. The shift away from identity-based voting to issue-based voting has meant that voters are more likely to vote on particular salient issues. And the gender gap in radical right voting is, in a way, a product of this de-alignment away from party-based voting to issue-based voting, which is that women across the 4 countries report specifically lower levels of anti-immigrant sentiment and thus report lower likelihoods of supporting the radical right. So in conclusion, the findings presented here show that in the gender egalitarian context of the Nordic countries, significant differences in vote choice between men and women persist. Moreover, differences in the political context and history between the Nordic nations, as well as between the particular political parties, are reflected in the composition of the gender gap. Nonetheless, gender differences in anti-immigrant sentiment explain the bulk of the gender gap in radical right voting. And so immigration as a single issue is a double-edged sword for radical right parties. While it remains a salient issue and an attractive issue for most of their voters, it also serves to alienate populations where levels of anti-immigrant sentiment are lower. So thank you. And I look forward to any comments or questions.
Marianne, thank you so much for that. That's fascinating. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about. If yes, Ari for leading us in an applause. So
yeah, thanks for the support.
We will. Can I ask those who are comfortable to turn your videos on? It actually works quite neatly in this room to have you all on this big screen next to us, bring you into the room. I will note too that once we've formally ended here at noon, we can continue the conversation in person for half an hour from 12 to 12:30. And I believe that you will come and join us for that half hour too, a kind of after global talk discussion. So please either use your hand function in Zoom or turn your video on and wave at me if you have any questions or concerns or quick observations. Maria, perhaps I could start. I was intrigued by this idea of European right parties, plural, being described as a family. Can you say more in terms of how these different parties speak to each other and to what extent the policy platforms of various Nordic radical right parties are actually quite similar? I mean, that's an obvious point, but just, you know, how important it is for the different parties to actually integrate their policy platforms with each other.
Sure. Oh, sorry, I heard feedback from myself there. So that's something I know a little bit less about, I'd say, but in general, I think we talk about them as a family of parties, mostly because there's like one kind of core connection between them, but otherwise they're quite different. So as I said, they take up a huge range of fiscal and social policies. Right. So the Nordic nations, the Nordic radical right tend to be much more in support of the welfare state compared to others. So in Eastern Europe, for example, the radical right is much more focused on, I guess, like call it like social regressive policies. So around traditional family structures, women in the home, more emphasis on the church. Same goes for the national rally. Now they call themselves in France, who have long ties to the Catholic Church.
Just a quick follow-up on that, then, because in your reference to the full range of policies full range of policies across the political spectrum that are otherwise being taken up by radical right-wing parties, is your sense that those policies are actually honestly put forward as part of these policy platforms? Or because you also mentioned the extent to which they're really just being couched behind a rhetoric that would otherwise. So is it how does that coaching play out in terms of otherwise representing what you described as a broad range?
Yeah, so I think that's where this idea of them being essentially just anti-immigrant parties comes in, where that's really what underlies all of this range. So even those parties that are much more in support of social welfare, it's still only social welfare within this ethnic bounding. I'm trying to think what else. I don't think I answered all of the question.
Well, I mean, I think we just have we sometimes have very simplistic ideas of a political spectrum separating left and right, as though it's a straight line or as though there's only one spectrum.
Yeah, I would add also that I think part of the variation is where these parties come from. And so, you know, they're bound together now, and a lot of them, there is, you know, movement or connections between them, particularly those that have made their way into European Parliament. So the National Rally in France has actually a fairly large showing, I think 18 representatives in the European Parliament, and they're engaged with all kinds of other, you know, AFD from Germany, all kinds of other radical right groups. But a lot of the variation between them comes from where they start out. So as I mentioned, the Norwegian Progress Party started out actually as an anti-tax party. But on the other hand, we have the Sweden Democrats, who are the most closely linked to, you know, the actual Nazis, not how we colloquially use it, but the founders were Nazis in the Second World War. And so the party stayed sort of on the fringes until, I'd say, like the 1990s, and didn't actually make it into parliament until 2005. And a lot of that had to do with a lot of image laundering.
Image laundering. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll turn to Amy and then Ari. Amy.
Thanks, Maria. That was so fascinating. And forgive the sketchy background. I'm staying with a friend for a few days, helping her with her newborn baby. So I'll be cutting out early, but glad I got to see the talk. And yeah, I would love to hear more about a couple of things. One is the, potential interrelationship between the structural and attitudinal factors, and in particular, either what the literature says or what you kind of think is going on behind the anti-immigrant setting and attitude, and how that sort of either amplifies or is in response to maybe some of these other sort of structural factors. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Yeah, maybe we'll follow up, but thank you so much.
Sure, thanks. And thanks for coming. Nice to see you, even though you're not behind me, as you might be. But so in terms of the interrelation between structural and attitudinal, so the general argument in the literature is that structural factors, particularly around economic position, predispose people to supporting the radical right. So in particular, like the first argument, I guess, would have been that men who work in blue collar manual work are suffering the effects of deindustrialization. And so we're turning against globalization and sort of multicultural and open politics. And so the flip side of that coin is that people who aren't engaged in those kinds of work, and including women who tend to be in public sector and service work, aren't turning against globalization to the same degree. And so I think there's very much an idea that the structural precedes the attitudinal. So they pick up these anti-globalization, anti-immigrant sentiments from the economic position. And you see that in other ways. So research on economies and radical right, in particular stuff that was looking at the fallout of the 2008 crash, it showed that concrete economic, how would you call it, like badness, suffering, is not directly related to radical right politics. Rather, it's translated through perceived hardship and loss of trust in political institutions. But another thing that I've been thinking about in this is how these parties actually create their own voting bases. Right? It's not enough to have these kind of economic conditions around. You need a political presence on the scene that links those economic conditions to immigration. And so you can't really have one without the other. And there's some work from the early 2000s that was trying to pinpoint down a precise percentage of immigration per year that would somehow result in radical right politics. And I think that's exactly backwards, right? It's not about who's coming in, it's about how they're being framed as they're entering the country.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. And so essentially, like with your findings, are you sort of thinking that the expectations for the literature sort of play out in terms of public sector and education being statistically significant and leading to this anti-immigrant setting? And that's only in terms of voter issue salience, right? The anti-immigration variable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think one tricky thing is the models I have, they don't talk about gender differences and the effect of the variable. So it doesn't say which is more important for who. It's looking just at compositional differences between the two groups. So I think that would be an interesting next step, I guess, is think about especially in contrast with other European studies, which have started to find that women are not less anti-immigrant anymore. And are looking at rather the closing of the gender gap. So Marine Le Pen and the National Rally have basically managed to close their gender gap. They're now around 50-50 in the last election. And so, yeah, I can't speak as much to how important the issues are for people, but rather that we still have lower levels of anti-immigrant sentiment among women in the Nordic countries, and it's most likely related to higher employment in the public sector.
Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Maria. Ari.
Thanks, yeah, and thanks for the talk. I thought it was really interesting and I think a really important topic for us right now. I wanted maybe just to kind of continue this line around what factors are most salient to different groups of voters. Just thinking a little bit about, our current context right now, thinking about the far right in Canada, for instance, being, in the past weeks, most dramatically, right, so focused on vaccine politics and the kind of anti-vaccine sentiment or anti-vaccine mandate sentiment as being kind of a key recruiting tool for them. And I wonder, especially kind of in this context of the radical right in the Nordic countries being connected to support for the welfare state and for the public good, whether, one, have you seen kind of vaccine politics being mentioned by them and in what contexts, or whether it's an issue which you think you might want to look into kind of moving forward? What are your kind of thoughts basically on vaccine politics for them?
That's interesting, yeah. I haven't looked much into the vaccine politics. I've started doing research on my second paper now, which is looking more at discourses online with the national rally. And there I'm seeing a lot about no vax passes and mandates. And so sort of a similar thread. And I'm sure we all saw, the freedom convoys now are spreading across the world, and we're in France last weekend, I think. So it's definitely being taken up elsewhere. But I think that point you made is very interesting about using one thing to bring people in. And I've thought about that a bit in terms of the People's Party of Canada, who obviously didn't win any seats in the last election, but they outperformed the Greens still at the national level. But they were also doing this bit of, they're present at all the rallies. And I live right behind the legislature in Victoria, so I see them. It used to be every weekend, and now it's every day. And there were always people in purple shirts talking about vaccine mandates. And then you look at what the People's Party actually have in their platform, and there's, one line about public health measures and everything else is immigration. And so I think it's like a way of pulling people in. And I think that this femo-nationalism, as Sarah Ferris calls it, in the Nordic countries is really doing a lot of that work as well. Sort of talking about women's rights and how women are only free in Western countries and the real threat is from outside. And by using these, at least rhetorically progressive points, sort of pulling people in to a really kind of regressive politics. All that to say, it's interesting.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great answer. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
I think Jody has a question from the room.
I just have a question about age. Did you do the demographics on age as well? Are younger women more likely, or women in their, middle age or whatever?
So I'm trying to remember. I think I had it in early models and it didn't matter.
Didn't matter. Okay.
Yeah, it's the same for religion. I was expecting to matter more, and then it didn't.
Good for models then, hey? It's good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just saw a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay. From Ted. Ted, can I ask you to ask your question? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Maria. Very informative. Thanks very much. Maybe the first question would be a follow-up to Jody's. As far as any thoughts on the rural-urban split as far as the gender gap is concerned and their sentiments towards the right?
So I wasn't able to test that from the data I had. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, I think it could really go either way. There's theories about what they call it, the contact hypothesis, that anti-immigrant sentiment is lowered by having more interaction across ethnic boundaries. And it wouldn't surprise me also if there was a similar rural-urban, especially around, who's being more impacted, like where, there's lower education, lower higher rates of unemployment in the rural areas, and that would also translate into a difference there in voting. But I don't have any data to back up those thoughts, just my ideas. And as for your second question about trendsetters, I think it's likely to see it actually going in the other direction, that the Nordic gap would start to close as opposed to the Western European one growing.
Right.
Because that's been a recent development. And I think, everybody who's tried to write about exceptions to the growth of the radical right has been proven wrong. Like even Jens Rydgren, who's a big name on the Nordic radical right, he wrote a lot of papers sort of in the early 2000s about the Swedish exception. And he published one recently that was basically like, I was wrong. Everywhere is falling. And so I think what we are going to see actually is just increasing support for these parties, including across gender lines.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Hey,
depressing. But
yeah, absolutely.
On that question, Maria, excuse my ignorance, but do all of these countries have similar systems of proportional representation?
in the Nordic countries, yeah.
Okay.
And they're also all countries with lots of parties that tend to have coalitionary governments.
Well, thank you, everybody. Maria, if you're able, can you come and join us for some follow-up discussion here in the room? And
yeah, for sure. I'll run down the hallway.
okay, no need to. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. Hi, Elizabeth. So we can continue the conversation with everybody here, but I think we'll have Maria in the room now, so that's great. We're kind of working on these new hybrid models. And so one of them is for the speaker to stay in their room where they have a bit more kind of quiet, but then come and join us for the conversation. So
I can wait until Maria gets to the room. That would be more fun for me
it
too.
would, yeah, good. And I'm kind of trying to stall here.
Okay, I'll come now then.
Oh, thank you. There you go. Sorry, Maria. Yeah, come on down. Yeah. Well, with that in mind, actually, one thing we do want to talk about in the center over the next few weeks. Next week, of course, is reading break. There will not be a global talk next Wednesday, so we'll come back on the 2nd of we'll come back in March, for heaven's sake, wow, on the 2nd with our next global talk. So please, everybody, enjoy the reading break. And then I think we're going to want to initiate some discussions about how we might, how our global talks, how our gathering, how our meetings, conversations might evolve as the public health responses to COVID evolve at the same time. So please, if you've got thoughts on concerns, ideas on how we can move forward at the center, please do share those with us. We'll of course move as very much in terms of public health orders, and of course respecting individuals' personal comfort levels with all of this as well. Thank you. Elizabeth, welcome back. Thank you.
I think you're muted.
You're
Sorry,
muted.
I did unmute, but my mouse is very finicky, so sorry about that. And I can't see myself, but I guess you can. So that was really fascinating, Maria, and I thought you did a great job in navigating the nuanced questions too. And I'm going to ask another kind of unfair question that asks you to look at completely different contexts, but even just to reflect on different contexts. I couldn't help, as I was listening to your description of the gender gap in Nordic countries, I couldn't help thinking about the contrast with the US, where we're told, I mean, I'm sure there's data, you've probably seen the data, I haven't seen the data, but I've read a lot that suggests that, the now radical Republican right draws a lot of support from suburban college-educated women, for instance. So that's a really different political constituency than the radical right draws from in the Nordic countries. And maybe as a historian, it was inevitable that I reached for sort of deep historical explanations of that. But you indicated those at the outset, that we have to be really attentive to the historical and cultural context in which these structural locations develop. So I was thinking, suburban college educated American women are very different from college-educated Nordic women because of the history of the countries and the regions, because they, they have a totally, American women function in a country with a much smaller public sector. They come from a country with a very deep ideology of individualism versus, a much more, to oversimplify, a more collectivist kind of political culture. So I could think we might find a lot of the explanation for that difference between US and Nordic countries in that deeper history. And I just would be interested to hear your reflections on that. But not because you're an expert on American political culture, but you are on the Nordic side, so.
Yeah, thank you for that. It makes me think about two things. I think you're right about the US and this, culture of individualism, the small public sector. And I think as well, the US has like a very different history around race and, the racial divide there and how it's been translated into politics. There's been lots of talk about how white women choose their whiteness over their women identity in their politics. But it's also just making me think about how, like, one of the concerns that is happening right now, in my little subfield, is that a lot of our explanations are kind of starting to fall apart. So you're talking about, college-educated suburban women, but we're seeing now, even in the Nordic countries where the gap is still larger, that all of those traditional markers of radical right support are starting to break down. So in the last Finnish election, the majority of voters for the radical right had post-secondary education. So even there, it's just, support is growing and growing and growing across everything, every facet of society, you can say. Right.
Great, and thank you so much for taking us right to the difference in racial histories. That's really important. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Rod, can I ask you to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. It's illuminating. It's also extremely disappointing, it seems to me. The Nordic countries and the scans, we have always in Canada been looking to this model as a defense against neoliberalism run wild, and always wanted to be up there with the Nordic countries when it came to Human Development Index and Quality of Life Index and so on. And the story you're telling is obviously very, very discouraging. It comes in to us at the same time that we're learning some very, very disturbing things about the radical right in Canada and the extent of the affiliations of police forces and special operations forces and so on with the radical right in Canada. So obviously a very different story, but I guess all of that disappointment just leading me to ask you to talk a little bit further. I think I heard you say that you're only looking to see the support in the four Nordic countries for the radical right growing. And I wonder, obviously speculative, but I'd be interested in your thoughts and anybody else's thoughts as to what it means for Canada. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm just trying to think what that would mean for Canada. I think what we're seeing now is very bad news. And in particular, how people are being pulled into that part of the politics through the vaccine issue, right? I think there's like and I guess it's slightly outside of my wheelhouse because it's more online sort of alt-right white nationalist organizing than sort of formal radical right politics. But even there, I think there's a real slippery slope around if you start with, you have somebody who lost their business and is angry about a vaccine mandate, and then they fall into this internet pit of anti-Asian racism and conspiracy theories about George Soros. and how the vaccines have chips in them, and you get sort of pulled in into that. But yeah, I think overall we are looking at a real increase across the board, and I think the Nordic countries are just a little bit behind the rest of Western Europe in terms of, I guess, the gender split there. And as I said, France now has the smallest gender gap. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that in the elections this year, now that Marine Le Pen has real competition on the right.
Yeah.
From Eric Zemmour. Yeah. So I'm just trying to think. Did I answer your full question? I didn't write it down this time, so.
Thank you. We'll be watching the Nordic countries with greater interest now.
Are there lessons to be learned maybe in terms of electoral systems? I mean, should Canada perhaps be a little wary of proportional representation, given how powerful these single issue platforms can be?
I think that's a very good question. And I don't know. I feel, I guess, personally conflicted about it because I vote for a party that loses out in proportional representation, or in our current system. But I think for sure the proportional representation in the Nordic countries has allowed for much more radical right presence. But there's other factors there as well.
And could it also be a system that otherwise it allows for a certain expansion, but otherwise does set limits? Like, is there perhaps, I mean, to put a positive spin on this, could there be a ceiling to how high these parties can grow as single issue? Or we don't know?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't know. Part of it, like, it's not inevitable. I mean, Sweden for a long time managed to control the growth of the Sweden Democrats because all other parties agreed together that they would not cooperate with them in any way. And even that sort of fell a bit apart when it became really politically convenient for the right to work with the Sweden Democrats. But even then, even within a proportional representation system, you have options, right?
Yeah. The coalition building process. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.
I'm just wondering, wanted to come back if we got a minute, to the notion of the welfare, the restriction of the welfare state to the ethnic and cultural communities. Is that a topic that's talked about a lot in the Nordic countries, and are there differences across the four countries in respect to the strength of that feeling that you can keep the welfare state, not just in a sense to citizenship, but somehow even more tightly defined to the cultural community?
Yeah, so there is a pretty significant body of work on Welfarechauvinism outside of just the radical right. That's becoming a more mainstream way of thinking. And it links to different kinds of citizenship policies. So Ruth Wodak has written a lot about the rapid increase in, and I guess sort of like cultural tests for citizenship. So all kinds of language requirements and how they're becoming much more popular across Europe. And a sort of trying, like a real concerted effort to link culture and cultural assimilation with citizenship and belonging. And so I'm not sure about differences across the countries. I think, there's differences across the countries in how strong the welfare state is and what kind of services. But it's been pretty well documented, this sort of underline of racism within the welfare state. I think Norway calls it like the dark underside of the welfare state.
Yeah, that's a really worrisome development, isn't it? This notion that you can increasingly restrict citizenship rights, or the claims on on the system, more and more nervousness about the sense that we're all in it together, and that there's a sharing, that you win on the roundabouts what you lose on the straight, and all that sort of notion of pooling fortunes within the community. We're seeing it in a lot of places, but it is really quite struck by the strength that you're attributing to that activity in the Nordic countries.
Ted, can I ask you to? Thank you, Rod.
Yeah, thanks for that, Maria. Just you mentioned, I think, following up on one question, the idea. I think you used the People's Party as an example, where they were drawing in addition to anti-immigration, they were drawing in people on the health issue. So if we take that as the right playing politics, do we, and this is quite a disconcerting development, but would you see the left, or would you foresee a time where the left side would start to pick up and play politics by themselves being anti-immigration or shifting in that direction in the Nordic countries?
Yeah, I think in the Nordic countries it's very possible. There's already a party in Iceland that are like a disability activism party that have taken up the strongest anti-immigrant line among the parties on the scene there, which is a different kind of marriage as in the other places. But I think there's a real potential for it in the Nordic countries, given the growth of this sort of welfare chauvinism and concern about, state resources being wasted on people who don't deserve it. I think it's less likely to be, an impact in other places, I guess. I think there's just more of a fertile soil for it in the Nordic countries, especially when you think about, how homogenous these places are. In Sweden, there's a lot of talk about the folkhem. So this idea of Sweden as the home for the people, and the people as being ethnically down. And I think that's probably has real political currency on all sides of the political spectrum. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Maybe just to interject, interesting you reference Iceland, because and somebody on the group here might know the name of it, but Scotland, Iceland, I think possibly Wales, but New Zealand have kind of a bit of a coalition group focusing on well-being, where they're trying to get away from the proverbial GDP metrics into more well-being metrics, more signs of a more sophisticated society. So just interesting to make the reference to Iceland. You're probably right on. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
So in a way, our left-right spectrum is one of these things that have fallen apart in all of this. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll continue the conversation in the room if anybody would like to join us. I was wondering, Rod, did you have another follow-up there, or? No, okay.
No, I'm just filing away welfare chauvinism as a title and a topic.
I know.
It really needs a lot more attention. But I have to say I'm coming away discouraged.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Not your fault, Maria.
No, and these ideas of ethnocracies. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Okay, thank you especially to Maria. Thank you all for your questions. And as always, to Jody and Kayla for all the support they offer. And we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Enjoy your reading break.